Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. And in today's video, we'll be looking at a potential 2024 matchup and see where we're at as of right now, about 2 years out. So before we get started with this video, I want to make a few announcements. So first of all, as you probably already noticed, this is Trump versus Biden. And what that means is this isn't guaranteed to be the matchup. I think there's a chance Trump doesn't get the GOP nomination. I think there's a chance Biden doesn't get the Democratic nomination. But I think right now, if you made me bet on an outcome, I think this would be the most likely outcome. I think DeSantis is a chance. I think there's a chance Biden steps down and lets Harris run, or maybe even Harris gets primaried and someone else gets the nomination. I think that, there are a few scenarios that could play out. But the first thing I want to say here is that I think this is the most likely outcome. Doesn't mean I'm guaranteeing it. I think it's, pretty stupid to guarantee things happening 2 years out when politics is so unpredictable. But I think right now this would be the matchup if I had to guess. That being said, I will do a DeSantis versus Biden matchup in our next video, which will be coming out, I think, either tomorrow or 2 days from now. So we'll look at that too. Now, another thing I want to say is I'm sorry for the lack of uploads this past week. I was skiing and I did not have the time to pre-record videos. So that's okay. We're back, though. We're back. And then, it's 2023 now. So we're going to start off with a presidential prediction because I know that's what a lot of you guys come to the channel for. So without further ado, let's get into it here. We're going to start by characterizing the safe states for Joe Biden. These are the states he'd win fairly comfortably by above, 15%. I think these are mostly pretty self-explanatory. I don't think there's too much to, contest by any of these. But yeah, so I've got 188 electoral votes that are solid for Joe Biden. For Donald Trump, I think we're going to start out with, I don't know how many actually, we're just going to begin here. Not Kansas, actually. We'll put Missouri, and I think that could be borderline likely, but I don't really think it's worth talking about, so I'm just going to do that. West Virginia, I think, is also going to be in that safe category. But I'm going to leave out a few states you might be noticing that, especially if you watch my channel back in 2020, I had Utah, Montana, Kansas as safe Republican. I think at some point I had South Carolina safe Republican. I think this time around I'm not going to put them in that category. So I also want to take out that first district. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's look at our likely Democratic states. These are the states that I think Joe Biden would have a 90 to 99% chance of winning. They wouldn't be guarantees. They'd be states that I think would, I'd be really hard to see Donald Trump coming back and flipping them. So first of those states is New Mexico. If you look at the 2020 election, New Mexico, wasn't really particularly close. I think New Mexico is a semi-right trending. I don't really think it's, zooming right the way like Iowa or Indiana or Ohio is, but I do think it's interesting to note that New Mexico in 2020 only voted around 7% to the left of the country, and if we do see a result that's going to be closer than we're expecting nationwide, we could easily see New Mexico falling into single digits. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see a pretty similar march in 2020, considering Trump is, kind of taken a hit in these past few months. But I do think that right now New Mexico would be below 15%, even if Biden does end up winning it fairly comfortably. You have a couple more states here. I think Minnesota we could put in that category as well. Biden won Minnesota by 7 in 2020. Minnesota is really problematic for Republicans long term because as you can see, is really high turnout. Like 80% turnout is really, massive, really, compared to other states. And nationwide, it was, I think, 7 or 8% higher than the national average. But what's interesting in Minnesota is that when you look at this map, most of the votes are from the Minneapolis area, and that area is actually growing. And it's getting bluer. If you look at this light red county here, that's Anoka County. I think that county flips in 2024. And Trump might make some small gains in the rural parts of the state, specifically the Iron Range, but I do think at this point in time it's unlikely that it would even narrow up. I think Biden would have by 8 or 9, potentially 10 points if he does well nationwide. And also Democrats this year in Minnesota, they continue their streak of winning every statewide race, and Tim Walz won by like 9. So I don't see a path for Trump even making it close in 2020. Nebraska second. I think there's not too much to say there. Biden won it by, I think 7% in 2020. It was redistricted to be about a point redder, but that won't change anything. It's left running enough that I think it'll stay the same. Virginia as well. Look, I know they elected a Republican governor last year, but again, that was mostly because of terrible Democratic turnout. It was because Terry McAuliffe ran a disastrous campaign. And also I think Glenn Youngkin was uniquely a good fit for the Northern Virginia suburbs. Trump is clearly not that. And Republicans had like another really good year in Virginia this year. They still lost the popular vote by, I think, 3 or 4%. So that to me, I think, is not, just shows that Republicans have a long way to go in Virginia. New Hampshire, not much to say there. Again, DC should be safe. But New Hampshire, like again, Maggie Hassan won her Senate race by almost 10% this year against a Trump-like candidate. And I know Biden, I think, is a bit less popular in New Hampshire than Maggie Hassan, but I'm pretty confident that he'd win it by a similar amount to 2020. It's a left-trending state, so we're educated. I don't think it would vote for Trump. But yeah, so let's now look at our likely Republican states. The first of these are just, some of these Western states that I don't really think would be that interesting. I think Montana, to start out, is worth looking at just briefly because there is a Senate race there that's contested. Obviously, John Tester's the incumbent Democrat. I think Tester's going to lose, right? As of right now, for what it's worth, I think he goes down by a couple of points, but he'll certainly outrun Biden. But what's interesting to note here is that in 2020, or just in 2016 to start, Trump won Montana by, 20 points, right? It was a, very decisive win. In 2020, it, kind of narrowed out to about a 16-point margin, I should say. And, Trump's gotten more unpopular since 2020. His candidates in Montana actually did quite poorly this year. They only won, the congressional vote by like single digits. So I think Montana this year would be fairly, close for presidential levels. I don't think it'll be below 10, but I think he'll win it by 12 or 13 as opposed to the 16% he won it by in 2020. Utah, similar thing. Utah was actually really interesting this year because there was a Senate race that was surprisingly close. Obviously, Ed McMillan ran as an independent, but what I want to say here is that I think it's interesting that Utah continued its leftward trend even in a midterm. So I think Utah could easily be below 15. Alaska, similar thing. They elected Mary Peltola to Congress. And while I don't think Trump's at real risk of losing it, it's a pretty left-trending state, and he only won it by 10 in 2020. I think it could, be a 7 or 8 point margin this time around. Could even be lean if we're being honest, but I want to be cautious here. Kansas, too, again, there's not much to say here. Trump won it by 15 in 2020. I think he'd win it. Like, again, we're talking about like uniform swing from 2020 in most states, not all, but most, right? Like, Trump is a couple points less popular than he was on election day 2020, right? Like in 2020, he had about a 43 or 44% approval rating on election day. He's now down to 40%. So again, it doesn't translate, exactly, but I think you could say that in most states it would be about a 2 to 3 to 4% uniform swing against him. And in Kansas, which is a left-trending state, I think similar thing. Iowa and Ohio, these are kind of the opposite. Like, these are exceptions. I think Trump would actually do better in these states than he did in 2020. That's mostly because they're left trending, and I think the best example, or because they're right trending, excuse me. The best example of this is Ohio, where in 2020, 2022, I cannot talk today, but in 2022, Tim Ryan ran, I think, the best campaign you could have run for a Democrat. Like, he was pretty, he was a really good candidate. J.D. Vance is a pretty bad Republican candidate. And it was still a 6-point Republican victory in a midterm, which tends to favor Democrats in Ohio, right? So I think Trump would Ohio by 11 or 12. Maybe not, maybe like 10, but either way, it would be likely. Iowa, I think he'd win by 12. It's a rural state, it's right trending, and the Democrats got knocked out of almost all their statewide offices this year. They only held on to one. So I think at this point, I'd feel pretty comfortable saying Iowa is not going to even be remotely close this year. Nebraska District 1, this is kind of the exurbs. It also includes parts of, I believe, Lancaster County, which is where Lincoln, Nebraska is. It'll be below 15. I think it was Trump won it by 17 in 2020. I think he'd win it by 13 or 14 this year. And then the main District 2, this is a Trump plus 7 seat from 2020. It's right trending. I think he'd win it by 8 or 9 this year. Florida, I can't forget about Florida. Florida's really just interesting because it's just gone so far away from Democrats in these past couple of election cycles, right? Like in 2016, Clinton lost it by half a point. 2018, which was a blue wave year, Democrats still lost it. Then 2020, they got pretty badly beat with Biden losing it by 3.5%. And then in 2022, like if you look at the Senate race there, which is I think the closest thing you can have to a presidential election because they're both federal, the Republicans won it by 16. And look, I know Marco Rubio is a good incumbent. I know that Florida was uncharacteristically Republican this year. But like at the end of the day, the fact that this race was like a 16-point margin of victory shows to me that I think it's pretty much gone for Democrats. I think Trump wins it by mid-single digits, maybe even more. So let's look at our lean Democratic states now. The first I think I'll give Big Biden is Michigan. I think Michigan's interesting because when you look at the 2022 elections, they were like kind of like Florida, right? Like they're uncharacteristically Democratic. I've seen the governor's race. Whitmer won by like 11. Democrats swept like the attorney general, secretary of state races by like double digits as well. And I think when you like looking at those races, it gives a pretty blue picture of Michigan. I think you could easily look at that and say Biden wins by 10 or 11. I don't think he wins by that much. In 2020, Trump actually put up a pretty respectable showing in Michigan. He didn't win it, but he only lost it by about 3. And I think that's what we're going to be expecting here. In the future, I think Biden wins it by 4 instead of 3. But either way, it's still competitive. I just think Trump has a pretty clear disadvantage here because of the suburbs and because I think working class areas are slowly turning against him. And then Pennsylvania, this is the tipping point. Or no, it's not. Sorry, it's not the tipping point, but it gets Biden pretty close to the tipping point here because Pennsylvania is his home state. He won it by a point in 2020, and if you look at the 2022 elections in Pennsylvania, Democrats did insanely well. They won the governor's race by 15, they won the Senate race by 5, and they won the House popular vote by like a couple points as well. And so I think when you look at that, to me, that is pretty, at least I would say it's pretty indicative of Pennsylvania being a lean D state. I know Trump won it in 2016, but again, Trump did a lot of things in 2016 that are not going to be replicated ever again. He won Michigan, which I don't think we agree isn't happening. And he also, came within a point of winning Minnesota, which is just bizarre to think of today, but it did happen. And I think, Pennsylvania, he won it in 2016, but Republicans have not won any statewide races there since then. Or sorry, I shouldn't say federal races there since then, because they did win the treasurer's race, but that doesn't really matter. And again, in 2022, they got pretty badly beat up here. And, the Philadelphia suburbs are zooming left. When you look at Pittsburgh, the city itself is kind of expanding and, having a bit of suburban sprawl, which helps Democrats. And I think overall, it makes it a lot harder for Republicans to win Pennsylvania. And so Trump can win. He has a path. I think his path would be, in theory, improving in the suburbs and holding on to those rural margins. But I think, suburbs are just so left-running. And again, they voted for, Fetterman was supposed to be a bad candidate for the suburbs and Oz was more moderate. He was supposed to be a good candidate for the suburbs. He still, underperformed Trump in, 3 of Philadelphia's 4 suburban counties. So the fact that happened and, Trump being much more unpopular in suburbs than Dr. Oz is just, to me, proof that Pennsylvania is going to be, Democratic leaning, at least against Trump. Because again, Trump, not a good candidate. I think we learned that this year. I think we saw his candidates really flopped all across the board. And I think a good example of that would be in Pennsylvania, where he picked, Doug Mastriano for governor. He was, Mastriano was a big election denier. He was a, believer in a lot of the Trump, stuff, whatnot. I'm not going to say it on here because it'll get me demonetized. But Doug Mastriano was literally just Trump in Pennsylvania, and he runs in this governor's race. And if you look at, the results, I'll just show you because it's so, so striking. He got destroyed. He lost by 15 points. He lost a bunch of counties that voted for Trump. And so I think, when you look at that, it just shows that I don't think Trump has a big feature in Pennsylvania, especially because it is Joe Biden's home state. Now, moving on to okay, I'll give him Georgia as a lean D state. I think when you look at, and this is he wins the election here, he's at 270, but I think Georgia's borderline tilt, but I'll put it at lean. Warnock won by 3, which I think is pretty interesting because again, Warnock won the November vote by about a point. And it wasn't enough to avoid a runoff, but he won it by a point, right? And so, the fact, he wins it by 1 on the same ballot as Kemp winning by 7 and Raffensperger winning by 9 or whatever. And so I think when you look at those results, it paints a pretty clear picture of where Georgia is at. It's still a conservative state. It still will, vote for Republicans, just not, Trump Republicans, right? Like Brian Kemp just stood up to Trump and he said, no, we're not going to overturn the election, right? And that, was, I think gave a lot of moderate voters and even some Democrats, they were like, okay, well, I'll vote for Brian Kemp, right? But they did not vote for Herschel Walker. And the electorate that showed up in Georgia, and this is, a lot of people don't know this, but the electorate that showed up in Georgia in 2022 was Trump plus 5, right? The exit polls showed that group of voters that showed up were, voted for Trump by 5%. And the fact that Walker lost that electorate shows, Trump is now more unpopular and his candidates are more unpopular than they were in 2020. And B, it's just a left-running state. I think a lot of Trump voters are now becoming more liberal. Not all of them, but I think those, in, in the Atlanta suburbs specifically. And that makes things just all of them, so much harder for Georgia to go red. So I think that votes for Joe Biden. Now, lean Republican states, I only see one of these on my map here, and it'll be Texas. I think Texas is interesting because it's a big state. We don't really have a lot of conclusions we can draw because the midterms, Democrats had a really bad midterm in Texas. At least, statewide. They won the contested congressional seats to their credit, but they did not do well statewide. And so I think when you look at, those results, it paints a pretty bleak picture for them. I think Trump would do pretty poorly in Texas. He'd probably hold on to his gains with Hispanic voters in the South. But I think, again, incumbency helps a lot with Hispanic voters. as we saw in 2020 and every election actually prior to that. So I think Biden would actually he wouldn't do well in the Rio Grande Valley, but I think he'd do all right, better than people are expecting at least, and that would kind of stem the bleeding there. And also I think he'd win Collin and Denton, which are the two northern suburban counties of Dallas, because again, Trump, as we know, not a popular figure in the suburbs. And I think lastly, when you look at 2022 turnout, it was just Democrats had such bad turnout from Houston and El Paso and even San Antonio in some cases that they were never going to be competitive statewide. They just were not. So I think looking at that, pretty clear to me that 2022 is a bit of a fluke for the Democrats. The same way I think Pennsylvania, no way Trump loses Pennsylvania by 15, right? It was a fluke from us trying to lose by that much. And I think Texas is the same thing, except it stays red, but I just think it maybe R+4 instead of R+10, what we saw with Abbott. So that's our states. Now these 4 states I think are toss-ups, so you can really go either way. But I think I'm going to give the first one to Joe Biden, which is Arizona. And Arizona, I think, could easily be lean. And honestly, you can make that argument. I wouldn't be too stunned if you put it in the lean column. But what I'll say is that when you look at the 2022 elections in Arizona, they were really good for Democrats. Democrats won all but 2 statewide races. One of them they lost by 0.2%, and the other one was the treasurer race, which again, treasurer races are a lot more localized and don't really reflect anything. The important race, the nationalized races, Senate race, they won by 5. They won the governor's race by about 0.6%. And again, they were not supposed to win this race. If you look at the race ratings or the predictions, it was either toss-up or leaning Republican. And again, Hobbs was able to win that race. And then Democrats won the Secretary of State race by 5, and they won the Attorney General race by literally 200 votes. But again, still very, very close. But the point is here, I think the thing with Arizona is that it's very swingy. And I think DeSantis could honestly win at the presidential level because, as we saw, Arizona is a conservative-leaning state, but this does not like Trumpism or Trump in general, which is why they rejected his candidates. They rejected Fincham, who again, Fincham said the election was stolen. Fincham was a big Trumper, right? And he lost by 5%. He got he got beat pretty badly, considering everything else that happened. And so I think, looking at that from that perspective, it just shows I think Arizona's suburban voters are just not having it with Trump. I think DeSantis, potentially maybe other Republicans like a Youngkin or a Scott or a Hogan or whatnot could do well in Arizona, but not Trump. And I think he's, uniquely bad for Arizona. So now we're going to go to our tilt Republican states. I think I'll give him all the Trump here. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Honestly, Wisconsin, could I honestly vote for Biden? I think that one's the one I'm most unsure about. I could easily see that going for Biden, but I think right now I'll give it to Trump. And just to go through these, Nevada, actually, no, we're giving Nevada to Biden. Sorry, I meant to give it to Biden. I just misread my script here. But Nevada's going to go to Biden, I think, by a Cortez Masto type margin again. Cortez Masto won her Senate race by 0.9% or 0.8%. So it was ridiculously close. But either way, as you can see, in 2022, 2 months ago, Cortez Masto won this race by just 8,000 votes. It's it's impressive because this electorate eventually voted for Trump. Exit polls showed this electorate voted for Trump, and then they reelected Democrat Catherin Cortez Masto. So I think again, the 2020 Trump voters are not super into Trump as much anymore. Again, people who voted for Trump in 2020 are still by and large going to vote for him again. But the fact that we Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, the fact that we saw all these electorates lean more towards Trump just goes to show that Trump, I think, has lost a bit of steam since 2020, and I think everyone can see that. So Nevada, Biden, I think, just because of better turnout in Clark County, Biden wins it by 15, 20,000 votes, but not by as much as he did in 2020. North Carolina is just kind of the white whale. It's kind of a reverse Nevada, and that Republicans get close, Democrats get close here every year. Even this year, Sherry Beasley did a really good job of making the race close here. Again, she didn't win, but she came within 3% of beating Ted Budd. But the thing that's interesting here is that, Beasley just could not, she did well in the suburbs. You can see she held on to Biden's margin in the suburban counties and the urban counties, but she did not do well with rural voters, and she did not have good enough black turnout to win. And so I think black turnout will be up in presidential elections. That generally tends to happen, and I think that'll give Biden a bit of a better margin than Beasley. But unless rural turnout really just does not show up for Trump, which is possible but not likely, I think it stays red. Although I do think Biden does about a point better than he did in 2020. So North Carolina, I think, does vote for Donald Trump, but by kind of a reverse Nevada, under a point type margin. Wisconsin to me is just, I go back and forth. Like on one hand, I could easily see Tony Evers winning because again, Tony Evers, Tony Evers. I could easily see Biden winning because Tony Evers, won this year. But again, governor's race is not always reflective of like trends nationally, and Republicans did win the Senate race, which I think is a better comparison. And also, I think it's fair to say that Wisconsin's still a right trending state. Again, Trump will do worse in the wild counties, which is what gives me a bit of pause. But I think compared to 2020, because like when you look what happened here in 2020, Biden won the state by like 0.6%, and it's because he held his own in rural counties, right? Like he didn't do that well in them, but he was able to get more votes than I think he'll be getting in 2024. It's mostly because Democrats are moving out of rural Wisconsin. I think it's because those kind of just trending right in general, and I think just trends in this part of the state are just so bad for Democrats that even if Trump's a weaker candidate now than he was in 2020, I still see it going red by, a couple thousand votes. Literally insanely close. I think Trump, I wouldn't be stunned if he wins it by like, 2,000 or 3,000 votes. Either way, it'll be really close. But yeah, so thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye, guys.